My name's Susan McDonald, and I'm the head of field projects here at the Getty Conservation Institute. And I just want to welcome you up to the Getty on this really beautiful early summer evening. I'm really honoured tonight to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Phyllis Lambert, whom we're really thrilled agreed to join us here in Los Angeles. I think tonight is actually a record crowd for us, so thanks for joining us, and I know we're in for a real treat. This evening's lecture is entitled Preservation and Building Seagram, and it's the third and final lecture of our current cycle, which we've organised under the Conserving Modern Architecture Initiative. So tonight's lecture will recount the story not only of this important building, but of the culture of post-World War II design, including the significant role that corporate patronage played in the era's real estate development and of the project's substantial role in shaping the landmark legislation and zoning laws in New York City. Phyllis Lambert will provide an unprecedented personal history of her experience managing the project, as well as the working relationship between Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson, and offers a detailed scholarly assessment of the design and construction process and the building's cultural legacy in the life of the city. Lambert's lecture will also focus on the stewardship and conservation of the Seagram Building, along with other projects. So let me now introduce Phyllis Lambert, who is an architect and the founding director and chair of the Board of Trustees of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, which is an international research centre and museum that was founded in 1979 on the conviction that architecture is a public concern. Lambert first made architectural history as the director of planning of the Seagram Building. She's recognised internationally for her contribution to advancing contemporary architecture, together with her concern for the social issues of urban conservation and the role of architecture in the public realm. Lambert's contributions to architecture have been recognised with several major awards, and I'm just going to mention a few of them now. The Seagram Building received the 25-year award of the American Institute of Architects in 1984. In 1978, Lambert received the Award of Honour of the American Institute of Architects as co-architect developer of the Biltmore Hotel here in Los Angeles. As consulting architect and client for the Canadian Centre for Architecture's Building and Gardens, Lambert received both the Honour Award and the Institute Honour Award of the American Institute of Architects in 1992. Phyllis Lambert was honoured with the Hadrian Award of the World Monuments Fund in 1997 for her international contributions to the preservation of cultural heritage. Phyllis Lambert is a graduate of Vassar College and holds a Master of Science in Architecture from the Illinois Institute of Technology and honorary degrees from no fewer than 27 universities in North America and Europe. She's a recipient of the RAIC Gold Medal in 1991 and has been appointed the Companion of the Order of Canada, and France has elevated her to the Commander of the Order of Arts and Letters. She's a Fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, an Honorary Fellow of the American Institute of Architects and the Royal Institute of British Architects, and a Fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians. Please join me in welcoming Phyllis Lambert.
Hi. My main, of course, focus is on the Seagram Building. But I thought it was kind of interesting to, when I was preparing this lecture, I realized how much of my professional life has been involved with conservation, preservation of, in one way or the other. And so I thought, and also the difference between dealing with historic buildings, that is, buildings that go back many centuries, and buildings and cities and of course, buildings today. The first one I'm going to show is, because we've already been announced, is the Biltmore Hotel, which I renovated with Jean Summers. And our major project here was just to really clean up what had been a horrendous mess and false ceilings everywhere. So it was just to bring the building back to its sort of glory days. It was about a 1921 building, I think. And a major project was in Montreal in the 1980s. This was a whole area that, these were 1,400 units, dwelling units, and everything that's black here was torn down, and high-rise buildings were put there. And the project was sort of well, you see, here you see these buildings were replaced by a highway. And of course, the theory is where you have highway, you have high residential. Or at least that was the theory then. And so those were all taken down. But the people who stayed here in this area absolutely wanted to own their own buildings. It's just east of McGill University. In fact, it was known as the McGill Ghetto. These were the kind of turn of the century, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century buildings that were there. And this was the whole team that put it together, and mostly it was a technical resources group who helped people in all the multifarious ways that you need to do when you're going to make a cooperative project. And it turned out to be the largest not-for-profit cooperative renovation project in Canada, and still I think is. And the major issue there was to let people live in the families, live in the downtown of the city, and they were so that families could live there and raise their children, so that old people were not turfed out, and also so that if somebody, that everybody could pay, that the rent was not going to be raised above what was possible for people. And so there was a huge amount of work involved in doing this. And this was supported by the federal government and projects of the provincial government. And then the kind of things that we did also in terms of conservation, preservation, was actually urban guerrilla work. And here I am holding a sign in front of the Shaughnessy House, which finally became part of the CCA building eventually. And we also did histories of buildings. My theory was that if people looked at buildings the way they looked at their families and saw a family connection, that they would become interested in saving the buildings. Then we even got to conserving buildings, restoring buildings. This is the Shaughnessy House inside, and we had to take out a partition that was put in there, and this is, and then to me, a major tool of conservation and preservation is public consultation. And so these are in 1984, the public consultation on McGill College, which was a private project that we intervened in and stopped, ruining taking over public land by a private developer, and then public consultation on in the old port of Montreal, so that it became a place that dealt with the culture of the area, and not, I think it was, people from the United States. Who was it? Like one of those big developers who wanted to come and do all sorts of impossible things in an 18th century old town. And here we also became involved with conservation of popular areas where there were people who were in trouble economically. And so we just go in, we learned it from people in the United States actually, to get companies to invest in it. It's not a donation, it's an investment. So these are kind of various tools that one has to use to be able to work in cities now. And of course, those tools change as society changes. Then another major project was the documentation and the preservation and the conservation of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Old Cairo, which was originally called Fushtat, when it was built by the fortifications, late 3rd, early 4th century Roman fortifications. This was after Camp David, and Anwar Sadat, President Sadat, wanted to make an international faith center. And so I went over to look at what the possibilities were. And of course, Old Cairo was the wonderful place where you have Coptic churches, St. George, St. Barbara, St. Sergius, And then this was a monastery of the Greek Catholic Church, St. George. These were Greek and Catholic cemeteries. And this was the land of the Jewish community. They somehow had all this land. And because the synagogue had been abandoned at the time of the 67, was it 76 or 67, I can remember the day, war, trees overgrew in the courtyard, and the acroteria let water in, and there was water rising from the base because Cairo had become hugely urbanized. So this was a fascinating project. As far as I was concerned, the really interesting thing was learning the history of this place. And here is what is the Ben Ezra Synagogue. It was called the Knesset, that is the synagogue of the Jerusalemites. And this one was the Knesset of the Iraqians. So you had these two populations there. And this synagogue goes back, the foundations are 11th century, and probably goes back before that, because there's some of these Coptic churches were 4th century. And then another, one of the history of this, historians were involved, material conservators were involved, the archaeologists were involved, and we actually made the first kind of modern map of the fortifications. This is a great scholar in Israel, Ben Sasson, took the documents that are at the synagogue. It's just a whole long thing, but was able to reconstitute who lived where, what, and did what. So it was a kind of a very fascinating study. But the major issue about it was that by doing the work on it and by publishing a book, one assured the fact that the building would then be known, and you couldn't just all of a sudden knock it down or desecrate it in any way. I don't know what's happening to it now. I'm trying to find out, because the woman who was running the Jewish community recently died, and I was always in touch with her. And here was, again, this kind of work that the archaeologists did in the survey of the building. And here was the building somewhere beginning in the work we were doing on it. The trees that were overgrown, and they knocked off all the acroteria, and the water was seeping in. And here was the restored synagogue. There was actually one very interesting thing in the conservation of this building, was the fact that we had a materials and conservation ethicist, and who was working in England, because the question is always the person who was I identify these people through ICROM, and the person who was actually doing the work, the resident architect, conservation architect, restoration architect, wanted to make everything better than they would. The wood, oh, it's terrible, would we have to get better wood? Okay, well, we couldn't do that, of course. Anyway, that is that, and those are the kind of issues that become involved with older buildings or large areas in the city. Well, all of these places have a problem of maintenance, and one of the major issues is the maintenance of the building, and so much of my talk tonight will deal with that. But the maintenance and the stewardship of the building is really very early on. In fact, the decision of who the architect should be is very much affects that. And then there are all the economic things. For example, if in a building, the building committee makes decisions, and they never are really properly constituted to do that. They try to make decisions that will cost the company the least amount of money, or one of the issues becomes use of materials again. At Seagram, we had the building committee, for example, wanted the fire staircases to put a soft brick. And so I argued that we ought to have the face brick, which is a hard brick, and it was less maintenance, and it would last for longer. But one of the problems is that the way our regulations work is that if you are if you put in expensive materials at the beginning, if you're a developer, okay, then that costs you money. But if you don't, then whoever's going to run the building afterwards is able to take those repairs every year, or every couple of years, whatever it is, off their income as part of relief on the taxation issue. So that, and then of course, as you know, mortgages are, buildings have short lives according to mortgages. So there's nothing that really encourages the maintenance and quality of good buildings unless there is a company that decides that that's an important thing to do. Well, here, I'm not going to go into the story about how I got in this position. My father was the head of Seagram. They were in the Chrysler Building, and they'd been there for a long time, since 1933, and they didn't have enough space. So first of all, they were going to rent a building, rent some more, and they were going to rent a building in one of the buildings by the new developers that were coming along. My father went to see it and said, no, this is awful. And so I came in and was able to identify who the architect would be, and I sort of knew that if I didn't stay, that Mies would not do the building after I'd chosen Mies, and so I stayed to work on the building, and of course, that was the really beginning of my, I always say it's the beginning of my life, tout court. And here you see the kind of problems we had. It's not just me as a single woman here. Actually, there's another woman. She was taking the notes right here. But during, let's see, Mies started to work on the building at the end of 1954, and the head of the building committee was this jolly-looking man. And here you see Philip, and here you see Dick Foster was his office, as Mies. And that's Eli Jacques Kahn. And then this was the clerk of the words. Of course, that's the model of the building. And while I was away, the head of the building committee thought, well, who is this man who does these stupid buildings in Troy? They're so simple in Chicago. And Eli Jacques Kahn was considered sort of the best architect for building modern buildings in New York, which were really sort of Mendelssohnian kind of things that they built. And so they said, Mies made a building that was, as you know, it's a building with a sort of a T-shaped building. It's not a pure tower. And so it's a 3x5 bay with a 1x3 bay, sorry, at the back of it. And so they made it into a 4x5 bay, and I went down to the office of Kahn. I said, oh, no, this is not your purview, you know. You're here to do the working drawings, but not to do design. He said, oh, I didn't change anything. Well, so this meeting was brought together to decide which was right, the Mies' project or that of Kahn and Jacobs. And of course, they said the Building Management Association still exists. And so they, of course, gave great high marks to the Seagram Building. Well, how did they find the site? And this is before I was involved with it at all. And so the various people, somebody hears that a company wants to build a building, and every developer, landowner, and real estate company comes out of the woodwork and says, we have something for you. And so the Seagram started to look around, and one of the buildings, this is the building they actually replaced, and this was it was built in 1913, and it was the Montana building, and Steinway had formerly been there, and this area here was not at that level. There were the open tracks here. So the Steinway, factory got their wood and made their transported their pianos on this railroad line, and then it started to become covered over in the 1880s or 90s, I think, and by 1913 it was, of course, filled in, and So Park Avenue became Park Avenue because it was a park. And so that underneath here, this is covering over the rail yards underneath. And it had this, all buildings had to be the same height, from 50th Street up to 90th or wherever, how high the city went at that point. And it was very interesting in the discussion at the Landmark Commission for the Seagrams much later, many years later. There was a discussion about would people in the, in 1990s, would they actually put up, change the zoning and destroy this line of the buildings? Interesting question. Sort of like, would, Bramante's St. Peter's or Michelangelo's St. Peter be built, or would they keep the old one? Well, this Park Avenue became one of the areas of the new development, of course, because in the area from 50th to 57th Street was rezoned in 1930 by the owners, who were the Gillettes and the New York Railroad and New York Central Railroad. And they felt that, quite contrary to the way it works now, they felt there was much better economics for them to zone these areas from 50th to 57th commercial rather than residential. And so, but that was 1930, and then of course came the crash, and then came the war. So it became an amazing area after the war. And this is a sort of plan that was drawn by George Fuller Company, they were the contractors for the building. And the head of the company played a big role. I worked with him very closely. It was great. So this is just one company, okay? These were all the buildings that they were building that time. But that hadn't been built. The Fuller Building had been built. The Pepsi-Cola, Lever House, Park Lane Hotel, I guess, and Astor Plaza, which then changed hands a couple of times. And all of these buildings, Corning Building, and these were all in the works in some way at that time. And when Seagram was built, and it was in retreat of the avenue 90 feet back, and Lever House was across the street, and that was, it had a, it was just a small, fairly small tower. And these two buildings, especially Seagram, changed the zoning of New York. New York zoning was established in 1916, and the idea was to get light and air into the city streets. And by this time, they had these kind of ziggurats, buildings set back at various levels, and so that the city changed the zoning. This is from a study that the city commissioned, and by Voorhoes, Walker, Smith, and Smith, and it was submitted in 1958. And it shows the newly completed Seagram Building, exemplifying open space at ground level, and Lever House, a tower, occupying less than 20% of the ground area, both providing a general feeling of openness at street level. Another goal of the regulation was to permit the maximum possible degree of design freedom in achieving economic, efficient, and attractive buildings in the highest density commercial district in New York. Now, this was the McKim, Mead, and White building of 1916. The building is the Racket and Tennis Club, and you see that this picture was taken in 56. But this was the kind of new building that was going up, okay? And that's the sort of thing that Seagram rejected. And of course, this was a superb sort of neo-Florentine building. And then just north of it, as you could see, was the building, the Lever House, which was built in 1951, 52, so that you have this kind of triumvirate in the area of these extraordinary buildings. It was the only area in town, really, where ambitious architecture was made. I'll show you what was happening in the 70s and 80s towards the end of the lecture. Well, Mies started to study the site, and this is one of only 2 drawings he made. I don't know how much you can see, but here is the tower. Here is Von Big Tree. This is the plaza, open plaza. These are sculptured as repoussoirs, and these are the edges of the site. And the only other drawing is of exactly the same thing. Mies was consumed with the interest in how you set the building in its site in New York. And when I was first asked, I was preparing the exhibition Mies in America, and I was asked by scholars at the study center at the CCA, what was Mies's idea about site? And I said he had no idea about site. He just wanted to do the best building he could. Well, of course, that was nonsense. I learned afterwards, Barry Bergdahl, I'll show you that in a minute, how important site really was to him. But he was not going to really talk about that. He said you had to do, he was trying to, I guess, inform students. Now, here is the building that he built, and so this is the 1x3 bay, and this is the 3x5 bays. And then the problem was Seagram didn't have enough land to be able to make a viable tower floor. So we recommended that they buy the site, which goes right through, so it becomes 9 bays deep, so that it's sort of a skyscraper down on its side. And then this was just to give some more. This Seagram floors was about 1/3 of the building, so this would give them more floor space in the building. And Mies wrote, "My concept and approach to designing the Seagram building was no different from any other building that I might build. My idea, or better direction, in which I go is toward a clear structure and construction. This applies not only to any one problem, but to all architectural problems which I approach." And so the skin, of course, in the bronze was an issue. And very interestingly, Mies, of course, when he did the 860 Lakeshore Drive building, the skin, the steel skin was actually more or less glued to the structure itself, whereas Mies was now working on another building when he was started the Seagram Building in Chicago, and they were using aluminum because, of course, after the war, the aluminum companies thought that this would be, they're working on in real estate and in building would be a very good use for their material. And so Mies took the skin away from the edge of the building and brought it out. And in this way, they affected 2 things. We could pass all the ducts for air conditioning, because 860 was not air conditioned. And furthermore, you would get a even all-around skin, which he thought was a really modern solution. And so here, this was a full-scale model he built in the office. And of course, models were very important in his design. He made a model of Park Avenue and to study the building and setting it back. And here is this is a billet of bronze, and this is how the extrusion that came through. It's like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube or cake, different edges, little nozzles so you could make it. And of course, this was what came out, and this is the assembly of the whole thing. And another aspect of this was very interesting. It was the first building in New York to be built with floor-to-ceiling glass. So here you have floor-to-ceiling, and you see this is the convector unit at the base to bring air, humidified or conditioned air in. This building is the lever house, and you see the whole spandrel, which is this part that covers the construction, the floor, let's say. And here, but it was brought up to the height of a desk, I think 2'6", in order to back it up with brick, and the same thing at the UN building. So by the time the Seagram was built, this was 52, and this is 54. I think that Mies probably had a role in changing that legislation in New York, because it didn't make any sense with a metal skid building. And also another problem, and this is very interesting in terms of preservation and conservation, was that Mies felt that a steel building ought to be able to move, and the 860 building really did move. And I actually measured. I had an apartment there and measured for Fazlur Khan, who was a great engineer, the movement that happened when there was a big storm. But the engineers in New York wouldn't have it, so they insisted on putting in truss all the way up to this floor, the 30th floor, and up to the 17th floor. That truss was encased in concrete, and this was in the center, in the cores in the building, the elevator cores. I'm sorry. And here again is the idea of light in the building. This was the luminous ceiling of the building, and this was designed by Richard Kelly, who had worked with Philip Johnson on Philip Johnson's house in 1949-50, the glass house, and he called it a tower of light. And if you notice most skyscrapers, the lights on different floors have completely different patterns. It just depends what the client wanted to put in to the building. And for Mies, this was a real problem. He thought that the building had to have a monolithic sense about it. And so, though he was the one who wanted the light, Philip worked with Kelly on that. Here are some of the issues of the building. First of all, here you find the tower shape. You see that's the 1 by 3 bay, 3 by 5 bay. And these elevator cores, you always go through them. This is where there was that, we called it the bustle, that piece. And then this is the ground floor. And here are the great rooms of what became a restaurant. And Mies took out a column here because it was only going to be just 3 stories above that, so one didn't need to have to carry a heavy load. And creating these great rooms, which were, well, this is 90 by 90. This is a mezzanine in the room, so they were quite fabulous rooms. But one of the important things was that you could always go, this actually, the granite, which is not left out of the core, I guess to make it easier to read, but it just goes right up to here, so it's the same thing. And now the sidewalk is also all granite. So, you come across Park Avenue, and you come across this wide sidewalk, and you go across the plaza, and you go through these, and this is Four Seasons, where the Picasso curtain sits now. And here is the famous corner that Mies worked out, very much influenced by his love of Schinkel and how Schinkel made corners strong on his buildings. And here is the problem of the reentrant corner, which of course has always been a huge problem. Vermonti has really problems with that. And then this is a bay, just a bay, a window unit, 4'9", 4'7.5", I think it was. And that had to do with being sort of pulling back the onion, the allowable, up to the mullions and then back, and to give the most floor area. It ended up being this rather strange number. And this is the way a partition came right into the mullion. So it was just sort of a beautifully worked out project. And here you see the building in 1959 when Ezra Stoller took this photograph. And I'll call your attention to 2 things: the brightness of the lighting on the travertine walls in the lobby, and the pools where all these little fountains here didn't work very well, and Philip had designed them, not the pools themselves, but the fountains. And so then he finally redid them and made a bank of the water in front of a big column of water coming up. So here you see the lower level. And one thing that's so hugely important about having this ground level, unfortunately, in this photograph, that's not lit up, but you could always see existence of people there. And most of high-rise buildings, you go in, and then you go into the elevator, and then you hit a wall, and then you get pulled up like water in the stem of a plant into the building, and that's it. Whereas here, you always see life in the building. It's key. And then Mies did that always afterwards. He did it, for example, in Toronto, the Bank Pavilion is separate, and so that you always have life there. And in Chicago, the pavilion for the post office, I don't know what they use it for now. Post offices don't work very much anymore. But anyway, that can be transformed into some other use. So you always have this existence of life. And of course, these plazas themselves become, they're oases in the city and slightly raised above the plaza of the city. I'm going to now show you a couple of photographs taken by Richard Pear. All the photographs I've shown you have been taken, and will show mostly, were taken at the time of, the building was completed or in construction, or at another time when something else was happening. But I asked Richard to take these photographs because the plaza is so very much important, and Mies had observed that in New York, all of the buildings lined up right at the property line. And so you're walking along the sidewalk. How can you see them? You can't see them. So he really set that back. So here you have these ginkgo trees. First of all, there were weeping beeches, and they couldn't support the pollution of New York, and so that was changed. And Mies had said this lovely thing. He said, nature should also live its own life. We should attempt to bring nature, houses, and human beings together in a higher unity. And so here you see, of course, that wonderful, display of water, massive, and people sitting on these benches. And here you see the plaza as an opening in the city. And of course, again, then people sitting all around the edges. These are just various aspects of the plaza. You're standing around near the benches and the stairs to the east. And here's an interesting, I think, one of the great things that Mies could do is make art out of necessity. And also the way the light falls in this image is extraordinary. This was taken by Richard, of course. But you see this lower element here. So you have all of this. This is slightly darker because it's the bronze glass of the lobby. No, it's not bronze, it's clear glass of the lobby there. But then this is outside the enclosure of the lobby. And then this lower part is a part where air comes in to, also at the top of the building, and here at the bottom of the building. And so you get this wonderful elementarist kind of architecture in doing this. This, of course, gets a sense of, as you walk around the various spaces of it, the openness, and of course also that idea of light reflections. This photograph shows the importance of that very wide plaza. And here, interestingly enough, you see that line. Well, that is the expansion joint that goes along because the railroad is right underneath here. And so one has to be able to accommodate that. And of course, Mies' superb ability to, this is much higher here than over there, and he takes that difference of height in the difference from the under part of the stone, the sort of reveal under the stone, which gets, of course, it looks smaller here because it's in perspective, but it really is. And I'm showing this because of two things. This is a marker that shows the Seagram Building property. So it's right here and there. And so Mies had this sense of, he was a big man. He said he was like an oak tree. You could change him like an oak tree. And so there's always this great sense of breadth and of generosity. This becomes also towards Park Avenue, it becomes steeper and steeper. The sidewalk or the street goes down. So this protects you. And that's another amazing invention of Mies's. This great Antiqua Verde material, marble. You should have had a railing 3'6" high. And so Mies said, yeah, well, if we make a bench 3'6" deep, then that'll be the same thing. And the city actually bought that. So and then you see this little tiny ledge here, and people crawl along there. Mies never thought anybody would sit there, but people always do. Also interesting, Mies asked Philip at one point to design the plaza, and Philip had designed the whole plaza in water. It's just a passageway down the center of just to go in. And of course, Mies was for freedom. You could walk in anywhere you wanted. You could go across the steps. You could even walk up here because it's quite shallow over there. And of course, Mies said, building come out of water, that's exactly what it doesn't do. So, these were the kind of issues that were discussed from time to time. Well, what I want to say here now is where does this come from? Where does the idea of the plaza come from? This is so key. And this is Mies's very first building. It was for the philosopher of Yale, R-I-E-H-L, and his wife. And this is in Potsdam. And I think it's no, it is in Potsdam. It's in a suburb of Berlin anyway. And so here you see the plan, the house. This is the sidewalk. No, here's the sidewalk there. And you come in here, this gate, and then this beds, the flower beds, and then you walk into the house, and then you go out in this terrace, sort of balcony kind of place, and you see, no, that's right here, sorry. And then you see this great drop down and this garden here. Well, that's amazing. This was just a sloped piece of land, and Mies made this huge cut, this very deep wall. And of course, the sense of this house, this bourgeois house from the garden side, it has the kind of the nobility and sense of presence that Seagram does. So you have to go right back to that to start to understand the Seagram Building. And then Mies, this idea of the platform was so very strong. This was his first independent project after the Real House, when he did a competition for the Bismarck Monument in Germany. And again, this very strong horizontal sense, and then the drop. Well, this is Orianda. This is in Crimea. I don't know. It was built in it was planned by Schinkel, Carl Friedrich Schinkel, in 1838. And why in Crimea at that point? I don't know, it's quite interesting. I'll have to try and find out about that. But what is so fascinating about this is this was when Schinkel was doing his two projects, the Villa Pliny, and this was in a huge volume that Mies had on his desk. So here's Mies and his sense of the kinds of things he loved. And this is Charlatan Offices, 1826. This actually was built. And what is so fascinating here, Schinkel said this was an ugly two-story house built by a businessman. And the second story is down below here. See that piece of wall? Well, that goes right across, and right across here. It creates, and then Schinkel built up this platform so that he could then make the story look like one-story house and put this portico on it and completely change the sense of it. And this is this great cathedral bench. Mies had a cathedral bench at the top of Tugendhat House, and that's the big Schloss over there. But so this is, Mies is coming right out of that sense of Schinkel, and he said Schinkel was, you could learn everything from him. Well, then, let's continue with that. This is the Tugendhat house, which was built just about the same time as the Barcelona Pavilion, and so that you have, again, the main floor is here. You come in the street level here, and then you have this wall. Actually, the glass of the wall actually goes right down into the basement level, as you can see in this, where you're standing at that level, and you have this huge drop again to the garden. This is the inside of the Tugendhat house. And then the Barcelona Pavilion, which was, of course, 1929, 30, was it? Yeah, 28, 29. And again, kind of levels of platform. So you walk along here, and you come up, and you move. So here you are again. Walk here. This is a pool, and this is a large bench, and these are walls made of different. This is glass with light inside of it, and this is these are various marbles, and this was where the statue was, so that this was a kind of, again, a platform, a podium, where the pavilion was sitting. And then you get to 1947, when Mies is making the plan for the IIT. He came over to be head of IIT in 38. And so he worked on this plan for the campus of IIT. So here again you have that platform. It's a greensward, okay? But it is, you look at this is the near south side. It's a collage that Mies, a montage that Mies made. And he had written in 1955, there are no cities anymore. It goes on like a forest. We should think about the means we have to live in a jungle, and maybe do well by that. So that this, again, clearing of the jungle. And then, again, this became really a way of being able to inhabit cities. You don't have to tear everything down. If you made enough of these things, you would have these kind of great kind of clearings in the forest of the city, these places where you could contemplate or you could feel comfortable. And this is the 860 Lakeshore Drive, and this is the platform. Well, there's no need for it. The two buildings, they're the two buildings, and so this actually connects them. But this is the grass, so that you don't have to step up anything. But it was very important to establish that idea of the platform. Okay, now we're going to get to Philip. And this is Philip. There's a wonderful photograph taken by Arnold Newman, a great photographer, 1949. Just after Philip had finished his glass house, and that's the brick house, because that's his guest house. So you can't have two glass houses, people watching each other all the time. Mies asked him to work on the building with him because head of the Fuller Company, the contractor, said, what happens if, Mies was 72, what happens if something happens to Mies? And I had no idea what would happen. So he said, why don't we ask Philip? And I thought that was a great idea because we were both outsiders, and Mies knew some people in New York, but he was really an outsider, but Philip wasn't. And Philip had the gift of the gab, and he was a wonderful social creature. And so Philip wanted to make the building a Gesamtkunstwerk, and he wanted to improve industry. He wanted to get everything that was manufactured, a building of this nature with a great architect. And after the war, one of the issues was Philip, when he didn't, everything was Philip's except the first image I showed you, which is, of course, Mies's exterior. But everything I'm going to show you in these is Philip's really within Mies's structure, of course. Philip made the elevator cabs, he made special executive bathroom. But what was really important was the idea of the Venetian blinds. They're either full down, half down, or all the way up. And that also the positions were fixed into 2 or 3 positions. And the reason was because Mies was very concerned about the building having a monolithic status. in 860 Lakeshore Drive, all of the, that was clear glass, and all of the rooms, all the exterior people had a gray curtain, and they could put anything they wanted behind that in their own room, but so that the building had a monolithic sense. And of course, with the dark glass, that also helped to achieve that. And this, of course, was the luminous ceiling, which I've already mentioned. Okay, well, light. Light was the great thing for Philip. And this is his brick house, which had been built in 1949. But by 1953, he'd taken 2 rooms and transformed them into this room. And this, you can see this is supported from the top, not on those little legs. But this double curve here is because Philip wanted to wash the walls. And how could you wash the walls and hide things? Well, he used a historical kind of form. And these curtains are the walls. The curtains are the most wonderful sort of sateen pink with silver and gold in them. And Philip is going back to Schinkel, okay? And he I think that's why he admired me so much, because he also admired Schinkel. And so this is a room that Schinkel did for Queen Louise in Charlatan Offices in the 1820s or something like that. And the light emanated from these walls. And we did a lot of research to find out what it looked like when Philip saw it, okay? And this is what we came up with. This is in 1930 when Philip was in Berlin. He saw this. Now here is his own house, the glass house, lit up at night. And Philip said that when you put on, if you had a light bulb in and it's dark outside and you have one bulb up, you don't have one light, you have 6 lights. It just reflects in the walls. And so he worked with Richard Kelly, and Kelly was a man who had always been, as a kid, he was very interested in lighting, and he worked for lighting companies. Then he went to Yale Architectural School in order to understand what to do about lighting modern buildings. How do you light a glass wall? Well, you don't. But here, you had to wash the light around so that would reflect back into the building, and then the trees around it. Now you see this mess of trees. I mean, it's really a mess. A huge kind of Connecticut idea. And here you see very fewer trees. And Philip was again working with this idea of Schinkel. This is actually at the heart of the house is this painting by Poussin. Philip was trying to really come back to this idea of he tried to change the Connecticut form of nature into one that was much more classical European one. And this is a painting by Schinkel, about 26, 28, Gothic arches. And again, you have the fence here, the structure, and of course the great steep down into the landscape. The fence here is just a little rail, but right down into the landscape, and he augmented that later. Well, Mies asked Philip to do the Four Seasons restaurant. Philip could, in Mies's great rooms, do wonderful work. It was marvelous work. But lighting was the major part of it. You see these are the kind of the curtains on the glass panels, glass walls, and they're made of chains, they're catenary chains. Of course, the catenary chains cannot. And silver and gold, and maybe a lighter yellow or something like that. And it's very much like those walls that his wall in his guest house and Queen Louise's. And over the bar, this very genius solution of making this work by Richard Lippold, who was a sculptor. And Richard, was very impressed by Mises, and these are 1/4-inch tubes that are different heights and gathered together. And what it does is it brings down the height over the bar. And then, of course, Philip was washing the walls. This comes also from the ideas of Kelly, who worked with Yale theater people. And so you come up these stairs and into this room. And here you see it with the just sort of bare bones of it, and this kind of sense of, you know, the intimacy that it could generate. And here you see the Four Seasons. This is the bar and grill room. So this is the stair you came up. This is the bar. And this is a higher level mezzanine over here. And then you walk, this is the kitchen back here, you walk through the lobby. And this is where the Picasso is right here. And this is the dining room with a pool here. And this is the private dining room above, but you see the doors are open there, but they can close off. This is the Picasso. Le Tricorne, 1919. It's about 19 wide and 20 feet high, or the other way around. And it's between the two rooms where I showed you. And that's a real problem of preservation, conservation, whatever. Now, I'll go into that in a minute. But okay, now I really want to get into the issues of problems of conservation. This is the curtain again. And this was, I'm just going to leave this up for a while. This was, of course, the whole curtain. So it's only this part here that we have now, the bullfight. And, of course, this would be the surrounding. This is a sketch of Picasso's. Okay, well, many problems arose because of the plaza and the, well, first of all, the plaza. One of the issues was that you could have built, Seagrams gave up half the area that they could have built. That is, the building is 500,000 square feet. It could have been 100,000 square feet, a million square feet, sorry. And and because of that, and because of the bronze and the fine materials that were used, the granite and the pink granite and the honey-colored travertine and the green benches and the bronze, the city did two things. First, they said, oh, this is great. We want, as I showed you before, they changed the zoning laws. And so they said, okay, we want to have everybody be able to build private public space. I mean, a private person do public spaces. And so they gave everybody 10 square feet of extra volume in the building for 1 square foot of open plaza on the ground. And so this happened all over New York. Everybody took advantage of it. And it changed New York. New York had never had any plazas or any little places to sit. And of course, there were other, if we have time, we'll get into it. There were other problems with that because amenities had to be legislated later, places to sit and not just concrete and things like that. So that was one problem. And the city, so on the one hand, the city said, great, everybody ought to have plazas. On the other hand, it said, the Department of Planning, the planning said that, the Department of Economics, Finance, said, oh, you are not using all the space you can use, and you've built a building that's much more expensive than that of the building of a developer. And so they charged Seagram a much higher rate of taxation than any other building. For example, Seagram's, they charged Seagram 35.5% increase on what was there before, and whereas the Lever House, they only charged 15.5%. So Seagram took them to court and took the city to court and went up to the highest court in New York State, and all along the line, Seagram lost. Why did they lose? Well, first of all, there were lots of problems. Nobody knew. The justices in different levels of the court said different things. In one place, they said, this was conspicuous waste instead of conspicuous consumption. And the fact that it was kind of a sumptuary tax that they were putting on Seagram. And finally, it ended up that Seagram only was taxed on the amount of area that they used in the building and not on all the other things. And the upper courts rejected all these ideas that had been put up by the lower courts. But however, the legislation stayed. And I discussed this with a man I know who's a real estate lawyer and a professor. And he said, he pointed out the fact that it's very difficult when, people don't, when it's a new law and it's confusing and people, there's no sort of standard for what they're going to do. But also, Seagram didn't make a very good case itself. And so that was one problem. Okay, and then I have some photographs of the plaza, and that's a very important part, so I'll just go through them quickly. It was wonderful because whether it was a gallery or a museum that was doing something, and the sculptor, they'd ask, Seagram had a certain amount of money that they used to be able to, because you had to move it, put it on it, and all that sort of stuff. But it was a wonderful kind of outdoor museum in a way. But this is the Suvero. This was a kind of study that had to be made. This is a Heiser sculpture, which weighed 46 tons. And so these were studies that the engineers had to make in order to figure that out. And this was a project that I worked on with Marilyn Wood, who was a dancer. And so the celebration group, and they danced against the windows, and they came out of the elevator doors, and there were flautists in the pools, and a roll of red felt came down from the top, and at the end, everybody who was watching this got on the plaza and danced. It was just a kind of a great event. Oh yes, and this is Holly White, who made the study of who sat where and when. And these are the virtues of the Seagram Building and people sitting around. These were his photographs. The children, nobody was going to say, you can't do this, you can't do that. It was sort of sublime neglect. And the food, Gus, and then people who were down and out could sit there, the bag ladies, and nobody, as Holly White said, the best way to deal with that is just to make the place so good that everybody wants to come there. Okay, so then I wanted to go back to the issue of maintenance. The Seagram Building was sold in 20 years after it was built, so that's 78, to TIAA, which Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association. And when this was going to happen, I said, well, we've got to protect the Seagram Building, and Seagram was perfectly amenable to doing this. And so this was in the lease of the building. Basically, you couldn't do it against the deed, but you could put in all the controls you wanted. So we put in really huge control over it, and the most substantive article in this lease was Article 26. And it covered modifications and maintenance. And modifications were defined as alterations, reconstruction, or demolition of any part of the site. And the document states flatly that no aspect of the site shall be modified without the tenant, that's Seagram's, who is now going to be the tenant, major tenant, written authorization. And maintenance focuses on protecting the building for long term. Maintenance of the site was to be accomplished according to an explicit schedule in strict accordance with specifications. I'm reading from the book, okay? While historic building preservation professionals use photographs, drawings, and architectural and historical analysis in order to define what must be protected, this work does not involve the work of the historic buildings does not involve the how of maintenance. In protecting the building for a long time under the rubric of maintenance, Article 26 spells out periodic care according to the time and the manner in which such action is to be carried out, and how. Because the procedures covered in Article 26 give a sense of what is involved in preserving the character of a building, I list them here in some detail. Lighting was to be maintained according to a complex lamping schedule. Exhibit D1 includes fluorescent lamp maintenance on a group of relay bases, incandescent lamps replaced on failure with a maximum interval of 24 hours after failure and before replacement. Dimmer control settings for the lobby were to be maintained according to Exhibit D2. The timing and manner of maintenance is similarly stipulated for all lighting, sweeping, cleaning, maintenance or repair of granite of the plaza, the granite caulking, the exterior travertine, the interior travertine, the exterior bronze, the lobby bronze, steps, pools, sidewalks, and graffiti of whatever nature was to be promptly removed, beginning with within 5 business days, with written notice by the tenants. Well, you get some sort of idea. You have to base maintenance. First of all, you have to hire an architect. You have to have somebody who is responsible for the maintenance. You can't just put up a building and say, you know, it's like us not ever going to a doctor. Well, it's very great if we don't have to, but most of us do, or have our teeth fixed or something. And so that it's absolutely essential to have somebody, a professional there who knows, has a proper judgment, but that judgment has to be based on the documents. So it's on the documents of construction, which means the contract drawings and the as-built drawings and the specifications. And service contracts were included also. The maintenance of proprietary equipment as well as cleaning and security operations could not be modified, cancelled, or permitted to lapse without the priority written authorization of the tenant. And it goes on and on this way to a point at which, or it says there is periodic maintenance, so it gives it the procedures, the timing, and of course, Seagrams had been operating the building for 20 years, so they could base it on their experience in what was the best sequence, the best timing, the best way to protect it. But there was also, the lease agreement between Seagram and TIA also contained a statement relating to the continuation of Seagram's policy of genial permissiveness, that little girl with her hand in the water, or all sorts of other issues. And of course, that doesn't happen anymore because of 9/11. Everybody put up barriers all over the place. Seagram has it in the lobby, a desk across where the central air, where the openings to the elevators, that whole space. And, you know, I guess those guys won by making everybody so scared. I think it's appalling. And so that this civility gets lost. Well, civility is part of preservation and conservation also. And also in the lease, the Seagram had to apply for landmarking the building when that would be ready, and it did do that. That was that was Article 28, I believe, of the lease. This is the problem of the air rights. This is the Seagram site here. This is the low part. This is the building to the north, the Citicorp Center. And this also was being owned by the Citicorp, was buying this up so that it was going to continue growing here. And this site here was adjacent to the Seagram building. And so I hoped that Seagram would either make a deal with Citicorp or with whoever was going to be buying this land, or maybe Institute itself, because you could transfer the air rights to another site as long as it was adjacent to the building. So that here you have what was as of right, that is what could be built, and here I did a study. This is models I made in my office, and this was what happened if you took the air rights and transferred it to this building, or to this block, sorry, that site, and what happened if you transferred it to this block. This is, I think, a little bit better, but so actually because everybody used the laws from Seagram's to be able to go taller, this was the new building the Citicorp built here, much taller than Seagram. This is the building that IBM built here, and within 10 years, that was sold, and it's now called 590 Madison, and they opened up area behind the building, sort of a garden walk-through place, and sort of an entrance to the building. And this, of course, is Philip Johnson's AT&T building, which then became Sony building. Philip had the temerity to say that he was competing with the Seagram building when he built this building. And now, you see the insult of all insults. This is the Seagram building here, and this is a project that the owner of the Lever House and now the owner of Seagram Building and this property is proposing to take the air rights and build this with it. New York is building these pencil-tall, thin buildings anyway, and this building was to be built by Foster and Associates, and it was planned for 2008, and as you know, the bottom dropped out of the market for everything in 2008. It'll be built. There's just no question. This is happening all over New York now. That is part of the kind of problem one gets in trying to preserve the building. And I suppose having, the way real estate goes, but having this built is better than having somebody go and put buildings on the plaza. And that could have happened. Okay, so the next thing I want to go back to is the Picasso and landmarking the Seagram building. When Seagram's was ready to be landmarked, the owners of the building, TIAA, had to go ahead and ask for landmarking. And landmarking is usually just the outside of the building. In the case of Seagram, it was the outside of the building. It was also the ground floor, that is the plaza and the lobby, and also the Four Seasons. Well, TIAA objected to the Four Seasons. They said it was constraint of trade, and that it was actually they made these incredible presentation to the Landmarks Commission. Here you have the sculpture over the bar and the tables and things like that. This is the same, see, this is where the sculpture would be, the same space, and they just wiped everything out. They even wiped out, they called them appurtenances. They wiped out the railings on the stairs. I mean, it just, that they called appurtenances. And then here it is, another thing of another view of the bar looking across the room. And then this is in the pool room. For some reason or other, they left the pool in there, here. But this was, and so they said, you know, obviously these were uninteresting rooms, and it was only because they had all these appurtenances, and the land and the city didn't buy that, and it was all classified, landmarked. But I wanted to go back to the that was a very difficult situation, and going back to the Picasso curtain, when the place was landmarked, when the Four Seasons was landmarked, the sculpture over the bar, the Lippold, and the Picasso were not included because the Four Seasons was a lease, and so Seagrams did not want to have these great works that they'd paid for as part of the lease of part, you know, controlled by the restaurant. And so when it came to landmarking, they were not landmarked because of that. And of course, the Picasso is movable. It's not fixed to, I mean, it's fixed to the wall, but it isn't fixed. I mean, one can remove it. The Lippold is a little bit more part of the building. Anyway, the thing is, they're not. Okay. So the building was bought again by, TIA sold the building to a man by the name of A.B. Rosen, who had bought he'd come from Germany, I guess in the early 90s. He'd bought the Lever House about 99. He bought Seagram later. So he's a very smart operator. And he bought the Seagram because he knew that he could add that, he could buy that piece behind there, and he could then, build a whole new structure there using the air rights, because he could do that, owning the adjacent property. And he actually also did a pretty good job of restoring the Lever House. But he, about a couple of months ago, he decided, he's also known as a person who is a art maven, that he loves contemporary art. Pretty well, he likes things that are very showy, etc. And so he started to speak to, actually the curtain now belongs to the Landmarks Conservancy, because when the whole Seagram company was sold, and so everything that belonged to them was sold, and I fought nobody really bought the curtain. It was sort of hard to do, and I convinced the sellers to donate it to the city, Vivendi, to donate it to the city, or to a museum, and they donated it to the Conservancy. And so the Conservancy, so the owner of the building called the Conservancy, or wrote to the Conservancy, or did whatever they did, and said, in 3 days you must take that curtain down because there's something wrong with the wall behind and we have to take it down. But this was all nonsense, it's specious. What really is, as the problem is that the owner wants to put his, as he does at Lever House, wants to put parts of his collection there. I don't know what he has that's that big, or maybe a big collection. Whatever it is, he wanted to do that. And he said that the Four Seasons, that the Picasso 1919 front curtain for the Tricon was a rag. So the Conservancy took him to court, and there was a first hearing, and the Conservancy got standing to come back to another hearing. The other hearing was last week, and the Conservancy thought they'd be thrown out of court, but they weren't, and so they have to come back in, at the end of this month, on the 30th. And there are two questions they have to answer. One is there a problem with the wall, really? And two is, the argument also was made that the Picasso curtain was so frail that it would be, it would disintegrate or be, in bad shape, really. And is that true? So these are the things they have to come back with. I don't know what's going to happen. But what I'm so appalled at is that somebody who says, he cares about, he buys the best buildings in New York, and he uses it for his own glory. And again, I don't know if I said this earlier, but in Article 26, I tied the placement of any sculpture on the plaza to written approval by the Museum of Modern Art, because people who in the building said, "Oh, we'd like to put our sculpture on the plaza," and so you have to have some kind of control over public art in the city, and it just cannot be, what any Tom, Dick, and Harry wants to put there, and so that the question of the of being able of a public art and the importance of public art and the control of public art, and that should be done by agencies whose job it is and whose concern it is to know what is good public art and what is not. And so that's why we tied it to the Museum of Modern Art. So now here you get a guy, he knows this, he knows all these things, and he says, no, I want to put my own work there, and I don't, and he's also, the lease is coming up in 2015, and he said, boy, if you don't, let me have, if you don't take the Picasso away, I want you to get your lease again. I mean, it's just absolutely madness. But for a person not to be able to understand that there is a public realm, that there are, that this, this work belongs to the building, it's part of the building, whether it's legally so at this point or not, is not the point. And so Therefore, I just want to really just wrap up everything now. I want to just say that, the issues of the building, first of all, the quality of the materials that were put in, the thoughtfulness, the proportions, the siting, the amenities, the quality of bringing art and architecture together, the creation of an amenity like the Seagram Building within a city that had no place you could sit down anywhere. And then the issue of how do you maintain that in the future? How do you make sure that this is maintained? Well, of course, the owner has everything to do about it, except if the building is landmarked, where therefore there's control of the public agencies, and they just can't do. So that's one of the protections one has, is the public agency. But not always, that doesn't always work very well. And then I suppose the last resort is the vox populi. And there's been so much bad press for the owner of the Seagram Building and his manipulation to try and have the Seagram Building a place where he can put his own, the works he owns, up without caring about the quality of the building, of what is there. I think it's making him, he tried to negotiate, and negotiated by saying, Conservancy could have it for half the year, and they would have it for half the year. If the work is too fragile, that doesn't make any sense. Anyway, these are the kind of issues, and so ultimately, I think it is the vox populi that counts. That people have to care about what happens in cities. They have to make sure that laws go in, like the law to like landmarks, and or various other, like public consultation. These are all tools that are absolutely necessary in protecting buildings, and as I said, also the maintenance by setting up standards of using documents that pertain to the building, the specifications, the drawings, and the regular processes of maintenance and control over these things. So these are the issues that we all face in contemporary buildings. I'm sure there are people among the audience who will give examples of other buildings, but that's about all I have to say right now. Thank you.